Down Styphon by H. Beam Piper. As published in Analog Science Fiction Science Fact in November 1965, this is the last story Beam Piper finished before his death. In the quiet of the innermost circle, in Styphon's house upon earth, the great image looked down, and Sesklos, supreme priest and Styphon's voice, returned the carven stare as stonily. Sesklos did not believe in Styphon or in any other god. If he had, he would not be sitting here. The policies of Styphon's house were too important to entrust to believers. The image, he knew, was of a man, the old high priest who, by discovering the application of a half-forgotten secret, had taken the cult of a minor healer god out of its mean backstreet temples and made it the power that ruled the rulers of all the 5 great kingdoms. If it had been in Sesklos to worship anything, he would have worshipped that man's memory. And now the first supreme priest looked down upon the last one. He lowered his eyes, flattened the parchment on the table in front of him, and read again. Petosphus, prince of Hostigos, to Sesklos, calling himself Styphon's voice, these, false priest of a false god, impudent swindler, liar and cheat, know that we in Hostigos by simple mechanic arts now make for ourselves that fire seed which you pretend to be the miracle of your fraudulent god, and that we propose to teach these arts to all, that hereafter kings and princes minded to make war may do so for their own defence and advancement, and not to the enrichment of Styphon's house of iniquities. In proof thereof, we send you fire seed of our own make, enough for 20 musket charges, and set forth how it is made, thus: to 3 parts of refined saltpetre, add 3/5 of 1 part of charcoal, and 2/5 of 1 part of sulphur, all ground to the fineness of bolted wheat flour. Mix these thoroughly, moisten the mixture, and work it to a heavy dough. Then press the dough to cakes, and when they are dry, grind and sieve them. And know that we hold you and all in Styphon's house of iniquities to be our mortal enemies, and the enemies general of all men, to be dealt with as wolves are, and that we will not rest content until Styphon's house of iniquities is utterly cast down and ruined. That had been the secret of the power of Styphon's house. No ruler, great king, or petty lord could withstand his enemies if they had fire seed, and he had none. Given here, armies marched to victory. Withheld there, terms of peace were accepted. In every council of state, Styphon's house had spoken the deciding word. Wealth had poured in, to be lent out at usury and return more wealth. If you'd like further refinements, let me know. And now the contemptible prince of a realm a man could ride across without tiring his horse was bringing it down, and Styphon's house had provoked him to it. Were sulphur springs in Hostigos and Hostygos, and of Styphon's trinity, sulphur was hardest to get. When the land around the springs had been demanded of him, refused, and since none could be permitted to defy Styphon's house, his enemy, Prince Gormoth of Nostor, had been raised against him, with subsidies to hire mercenaries and gifts of fire seed. When Gormoth had conquered Hostigos, he was pledged to give the sulphur springs to Styphon's house. Things like that were done all the time. But now Tosphis was writing thus to Styphon's voice himself. For a moment the impiety of it shocked Sesklos. Then he pushed aside Tosphis' letter and looked again at the one from Viblos, the high priest of the temple at Nostor town. 3 moons ago, a stranger calling himself Kalvan and claiming to be an exiled prince from a far country, the boast of every needy adventurer, had appeared in Hostigos. A moon later, Tosphis had made this Kalvan commander of his soldiers, and had set guards on all the ways out of Hostigos, allowing any to enter but none to leave. He had been informed of that at the time, but had thought nothing of it. Then, 6 days ago, the Hostigi had captured Tar Dombra, the castle guarding Gormoth's easiest way into Hostigos. The Castellan, a Count Feblon, cousin to Gormoth, had been released on ransom oath, with a letter to Gormoth in which Tosphis had offered peace and friendship and the teaching of fire-seed making. A priest of Styphon, a black-robe believer who had been at the castle, had also been released to bear Tosphis' letter of defiance to him. It had, of course, been the stranger, Kalvan, who had taught Tosphis' people the fire-seed secret. He wondered briefly if he could be a renegade from Styphon's house. No, only yellow-robed priests of the inner circle knew the full secret as Tosphes had written it, and had one of these abscond, the news would have reached him as swiftly as galloping relays of horses could bring it. Some inner circle priest could have written it down, a thing utterly forbidden, and the writing fallen into unconsecrated hands, but he questioned that. The proportions were different, more saltpetre and less charcoal. He would have Tosphes' sample tried. It might be better than their own. A man, then, who had rediscovered the secret? That could be, though it had taken many years and many experiments to perfect the processes, especially the caking and grinding. He shrugged. That was not important. The important thing was that the secrecy was broken. Soon anyone could make fire seed, and then Styphon's house would be only a name, and a name of mockery. Perhaps, though, he could postpone the end for as long as mattered. He was near his 90th year. Soon he would die, and for each man, when he dies, the world ends. Letters of urgency to the archpriests of the 5 great temples, telling them all. A story to be circulated among the secular rulers that fire seed stolen by bandits was being smuggled and sold. Prompt investigation of all stories of anyone collecting sulphur or saltpetre or building or altering grinding mills. Immediate death by assassination for anyone suspected of knowing the secret. And, of course, destruction of Hostigos, none in it to be spared, even for slavery. Gormoth had been waiting until his crops were harvested. He must be made to strike now. And as archpriest of Styphon's house upon earth to Nostor, this was quite beyond poor Viblos' capacities, with more silver and fire seed and arms for Gormoth. He glanced again at Viblos' letter. A copy of Tosphes' letter to him had been sent to Gormoth. Why then? Gormoth knew the fire seed secret himself. It had been daring and fiendishly clever of Tosphes to give this deadly gift to his enemy, and with the archpriest, 50 mounted guardsmen of the temple, their captain to be an inner circle priest without robe, and more silver to corrupt Gormoth's nobles and his mercenary captains, and a special letter to the high priest of the temple at Sasktown. It had been planned to use Prince Sarask of Sask as a counterpoise to Gormoth, when Gormoth had grown too mighty by the conquest of Hostigos. The time for that was now. Gormoth was needed to destroy Hostigos. Then he, too, must be destroyed before he began making fire seed in Nostor. He struck the gong thrice, and as he did, he thought again of the mysterious Kalvan. That was nothing to shrug off. It was important to learn whence he had come before he appeared. He was intrigued by Viblos' choice of that word, in Hostigos, and with whom he had been in contact. He could have come from some distant country, in which fire seed was commonly made by all. He knew of none such, but it could well be that the world was larger than he thought. Or could there be other worlds? The idea had occurred to him, now and then, as an idle speculation. It was one of those small late-afternoon gatherings, with nobody seeming to have a care in the world, lounging indolently, smoking, sipping tall drinks, nibbling canapes, talking and laughing. Verkan Vale, who would be chief of Paratime Police after year-end day, flicked his lighter and held it for his wife, Hadron Dalla, then applied it to his own cigarette. Across the low table, Tortha Calf, the retiring chief, was mixing another drink, with the concentrated care of an alchemist compounding the elixir of life. The Dergabar University people, the elderly gentleman who was head of the Department of Paratemporal Theory, the lady who was professor of Outtime History, I4, and the young man who was director of Outtime Study Operations, were all smiling like 3 pussy cats at a puddle of spilled milk. "You'll have it all to yourselves," he told them. "The Paratime Commission has declared that timeline a study area, and it's absolutely quarantined to everybody but university personnel and accredited students, and 5 adjoining, near-identical timelines for comparison study. And I will make it my personal business to see that the quarantine is rigidly enforced." Tortha Calf looked up. "After I retire, I'll have a seat on the commission myself," he said. "I'll make it my business to see that the quarantine isn't revoked or diluted. I wish we could account for those 4 hours after he was caught in the transposition field and before he came to that peasant's farm," the paratemporal theorist fretted. "We have no idea what he was doing." "Wandering in the woods, trying to orient himself," Dalla said. I'd say sitting and thinking for a couple of hours, trying to figure out what happened to him. A paratemporal shift like that is a pretty shattering experience for an outtimer. I don't think he was changing history all by himself, if that's what you're worrying about. You can't say that, the paratemporal theorist reproved. He might have killed a rattlesnake which would otherwise have fatally bitten a child who would otherwise have grown up to be an important personage. That sounds far-fetched and trivial, but paratemporal alternate probability is built on such trifles. Who knows what started the Aryan migration eastward instead of westward on that sector? Some chief's hangover, some tribal wizard's nightmare. Well, that's why you're getting those 5 control study timelines. The operations director said, and that reminds me, our people stay out of hostigos on all of them for a while. We don't want them massacred along with the resident population by Gormoth's gang or forced to use first-level weapons in self-defense. What bothers me, the lady professor said over the rim of her glass, is Val's beard. It bothers me too, Dalla said, but I'm getting used to it. He grew it when he went out to that timeline, and he hasn't shaved it off since. It begins to look like a permanent fixture. And Dalla's a blonde now. Blondes are less conspicuous on Aryan Trans-Pacific. They're both going to be on and off that timeline all the time now. Well, your exclusive rights don't exclude the Paratime Police. I told you I was going to give that timeline my personal attention. Well, you'll not introduce a lot of probability contamination, will you? The paratemporal theorist asked anxiously. We want to observe the effect of this man's appearance on that timeline. No, of course not, but I'm already established with these people. I am Verkan, a free trader from Grefchar. That's the kingdom around the Great Lakes. I am now supposed to be travelling on horseback to Zygros, about where Quebec is on Europe-American. I have promised Lord Kalvan to recruit brass founders to teach the hostage how to cast brass cannon. He needs light field pieces badly. Don't they have cannon of their own? The historian asked. I thought you said. Wrought iron, welded up and strengthened with shrunk-on rings. They have iron works. There's a lot of bog iron mined in that section, but no brass foundries. There are some at Zygros. They get their copper and tin by water from the west. He turned to the operations director. I won't be able to get back, plausibly, for another 30 days. Can you have your first study team ready by then? They'll be the Zygrosi brass founders. The young man nodded. They have everything now but local foundry techniques and correct Zygrosi accent. They'll need practice. You can't get manual dexterity by hypnomech. Yes, 30 days will be plenty. Good. We have 2 Paratime police agents in Hostigos now, a supposed blind minstrel and a supposed half-witted boy. As soon as I show up with your crowd, they can take off their coats and go to work, and they won't even have to hunt for coat hooks. And I'll set up a trading depot to mask your conveyor head. After that, you'll be in business. But you're helping him win, the paratemporal theorist objected. That's probability contamination. No, it isn't. If I didn't bring in fake Zygrosi brass founders, he'd send somebody else to get real ones. I will give him information too, just what any other wandering pack trader would. I may even go into battle with him, as I did at Tar Dombra with a local flintlock, but I want him to win. I admire the man too much to hand him an unearned victory. He sounds like quite a man, the lady historian said. I'd like to meet him myself. Better not, Eldra, Dalla warned. This princess of his is handy with a pistol. Yes, the man's a genius. Only a police corporal on his own timeline, which shows how outtimers let genius go to waste. We investigated his previous history. Only son of a clergyman. Father named him for a religious leader and wanted him to be a clergyman too. As a boy, he resisted, passively, scamped all his studies at college except history, and particularly military history, in which he was much interested. Then they had this war in Korea, you know what that was, and it offered him an escape from the career he was being forced into. Father died while he was at war, mother a year later. After the war, he entered the Pennsylvania State Police. Excellent record, as far as his opportunities went, held down by routine because nobody recognized him for what he was. Then he blundered into the field of that conveyor just when it went weak, and 3 months ago, no, just at another time, he was sure of that, he had been Corporal Calvin Morrison, Pennsylvania State Police. Now he was the Lord Kalvan, in command of the army of Prince Styphon of Hostigos, and soon he would marry Styphon's daughter Ryla and become heir matrimonial to the princely throne. That couldn't have happened in his own world. Hostigos, of course, was no vast realm. It was only as big as Centre and Union counties, Pennsylvania, with snips of Clinton and Lycoming. That was precisely what it was, too, except that here and now there was no Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It was part of the great kingdom of Hosharfax, Hos meant great, ruled by a king Kaifranos. No, just reigned over lightly. Outside his own capital, at the mouth of the Susquehanna, Kaifranos' authority was non-existent, the present situation, for example. When he was less evident, going to arrest a perfectly routine hillbilly murderer, he had entered what could only have been a time machine. Emerging from it, he had landed on what could only have been another time dimension. He had theorized a little about that, and his theories had demolished themselves half-constructed. Then he had given it up and dismissed the whole subject. He had other things to think about. Ryla, for one. It was hard not to think about her all the time. And commanding an army, once he got it made into one. And manufacturing gunpowder in competition with Styphon's house, and fighting a war against uncomfortably steep odds. And at the moment, a meeting of the general staff, all of whom were new at it. So, for that matter, was he? But he had a few vague ideas of military staff organization which put him several up on any of the others. And he was hot and sweat-sticky, because he was wearing close to 30 pounds of armor to accustom himself to the weight. They all stood around the big table, looking at the relief map of Hostigos and surroundings which covered the entire top. Just to show you, none of this crowd had ever realized that maps were weapons of war. Maps here and now were illuminated parchment scrolls, highly artistic and wildly inaccurate. This one had taken over a month, he and Ryla doing most of the work from what he remembered of the US. Geological survey maps he'd used on the state police, from hundreds of talks with peasants, soldiers, woodsmen and landlords, and from a good deal of personal horseback reconnaissance. The bakeries in Nostor work night and day. That was old Zentos, the blue-robed priest of Dralm, who was also Prince Styphon's chancellor and, because of contacts with his co-religionists in Nostor, head of espionage and fifth-column operations. And milk cannot be bought at any price. It is all being made into cheese, and most of the meat is being ground for smoked sausages. Field rations, stuff a soldier could carry in his haversack and eat uncooked, that could be stored, but Zentos also had reports of oxen being commandeered and peasants impressed as drivers. That wouldn't be done too long in advance. Then they'll strike soon, somebody said. Taking Tardombra hasn't stopped Gormoth at all. It delayed him, Prince Ptosphes said. He'd be pouring troops in through Seven Hills Valley now if we hadn't. There was a smile on the thin lips between the pointed grey moustache and the small chin beard. Styphon had been learning to smile again since the powder mill had gone into production. He hadn't before. Styphon, bulky and grizzle-bearded, stood glowering at the map. He had been chief captain of Hostigos for as long as Styphon had been prince. Now he was second in command, field marshal and chief of operations, and gratifyingly unresentful at Lord Kalvan being placed over him. His idea of war was to hit every head you saw, and whoever hit the most heads first won. All this staff stuff, maps and fifth columns and logistics and intelligence and security, he did not understand, and he was happy to let somebody do it who did. He'd been informed that Lord Kalvan had been hurled into the past from 1,000 years in the future by sorcery, and he probably half suspected that Lord Kalvan was a sorcerer himself. Yes, but where? He wanted to know. Styphon drew his sword. It was a rapier. The bladesmiths at Tar Hostigos had been swamped with orders for rapiers since this crowd had learned that a sword has a point and that a thrust beats a swinging cut. He used his point now to trace the course of the West Branch, the Athen, here and now, from the Otherwhen site of Muncie down to where Milton ought to be. The point rested on the river midway between them. "Marrack's Ford," he said. "Oh, no, Prince," Styphon growled. "Go all the way around the mountain and all the way up East Hostigos. He won't do that. Here's where he'll try to come in." He drew his own sword, long, heavy, and double-edged. none of these newfangled pokers for him, and pointed to the juncture of Bald Eagle Creek and the river at the site of Loch Haven. "Lystra Mouth," he said. "He can move his whole army west along the river, cross here if we let him, and go up the Lystra Valley to the Sasky border. And that's where all our ironworks are." Now that was something. Not so long ago, Styphon had taken weapons for granted. Now he was realizing they had to be produced. That started an argument. Somebody thought Gormoth would try to force one of the gaps. Not Dombra, Ante's Gap. That was too strong. Maybe Vreelos, Mackelhattan, or the gap back of where South Williamsport ought to be. "He'll attack where he can best use his cavalry," young Harmacross, who was a cavalryman himself, declared. "That's what he has the most of." That was true. Gormoth's cavalry superiority was something to worry, not to say be frightened about. "He'll attack where we don't expect him to." That was Rilla, in male riding dress, a big dagger on her belt and a pheasant feather in her cap, leaning forward on the map table across from him. Rilla was the nicest of many nice things, here and now. She was beautiful, blonde hair almost shoulder-length, laughing blue eyes, impudent tilty little nose dusted with golden freckles, gay and fun-loving. She was utterly fearless. He'd first seen her riding into a cavalry skirmish at the head of her father's troopers. But best of all, after the wonderful very best that she loved him and was going to marry him, the girl had a brain and wasn't afraid to use it. "That's right," he agreed. "Where don't we expect him? You know what that means?" Tosphys asked. He had a pretty good brain himself. "It means we'll have to be strong enough to resist everywhere." His rapier point swung almost from one end of the map to the other. "With 5,000, and that counts boys with bows and arrows and peasant grandfathers with pitchforks," Styphon demanded. "Don't joke about such things, Prince.